live on YouTube, so you're good to get started.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is ANDRYCZYK. I administer the Ukrainian Studies program at the Harriman Institute, Columbia University. Thank you to everyone who's joining us for this talk by Mykola Riabchuk. This event is co-sponsored by our Ukrainian Studies program and by the East Central European Center at the Harriman Institute, Columbia University. After over a month of protests, it's now possible to make some preliminary observations on what has been taking place in Belarus, to see what these developments have in common with what occurred in Ukraine in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity or Maidan, and what's different, but also on a grander scale to determine the significance of today's protests for Belarus as a European country, 30 years after the takedown of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. Luckily, we are in very good hands today. We have a very qualified scholar who will present on the topic. Our presenter today is Mykola Riabchuk, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Political and Nationality Studies of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine and a lecturer at the University of Warsaw and the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He is coming to us today from Kyiv. He is honorary president of the Ukrainian Pen Center and heads the jury of the Angelus International Literary Award and the Yuri Shevelov National Award. Dr. Riabchuk penned several books and many articles on civil society, state and nation building, nationalism, national identity, and post-communist transition in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine. 5 of his books were translated into Polish and 1 into French, German, and Hungarian. His work was distinguished with a number of national and international awards and fellowships, including Fulbright, Regan Fashel, and Urias. After our presentation by Mykola Riabchuk, you'll have a chance to ask some questions. And our event today will be wrapping up at 1 o'clock. The title of Mykola Riabchuk's talk is "What Does Belarus Teach Us? East European Revolutions from Warsaw and Prague to Kyiv and Minsk." Welcome, Mykola.
Thank you, Mark, for introducing me and for inviting to deliver this lecture. I must say that it had to be delivered 5 months ago when I was in Toronto and was invited, was supposed to come to New York, to Columbia. Unfortunately, quarantine changed our plans. But now I'm happy to have this opportunity, finally, at least online. Of course, developments, in particular in Belarus, changed influenced my topic, changed it substantially. So I'll be talking today about not only about Belarus, or more precisely about Belarus, but I'll try to place developments in Belarus in a much broader context of East European revolutions. I consider this a single process, which has not been completed yet. It still lasts. We still have unfinished revolutions in many countries, especially in the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia, and now, as we see, in Belarus. So my perspective is a kind of long durée perspective, and I first of all I'll try to introduce you my main hypothesis. So it's a kind of spoiler, because actually my subtitle largely contains answer to the title, to the question is the title. But it's not answers. It's as I put it, hypothesis, which can be problematized, questioned, challenged during our discussion. So Belarusian events from the long durée perspective should be seen specifically as not something incidental, not a fortuity, but part of a larger historical process that began in 1980 in Poland and gained a snowball dynamic in 1989 in Central East Europe. Then it spread to the Balkans and USSR. All these revolutions were determined by similar factors, had the similar agendas and similar driving forces.
Mykola, maybe could you, excuse me for a second, put in presentation mode, your PowerPoint presentation, maybe it'll be easier to see.
I see. Oh, sorry. You'd like me to, this way?
Very good, thank you.
All right.
Right.
So secondly, each revolution had its own national, regional, cultural specificity, which influenced its speed and scope, success or failure is both immediate and long-term results. Thirdly, external factors did not play a significant role in these revolutions, but appeared crucial in post-revolutionary developments. The successful transition of non-Soviet post-communist states was largely determined by the positive impact of European Union and NATO, while the post-Soviet states were deprived of such a support and their transitions were either arrested or aborted. And fourthly, the failure of a revolution is not the end. As long as its structural causes, the need for political, social, and economic modernization remain unaddressed. Whatever happens in Belarus now, dictatorship cannot win in a long run. As long as there is a nation and civil society, and they are, democratization and modernization are inevitable. Now, I'll try to problematize, to address briefly three keywords which are in the title of my title and subtitle of my presentation, words which are important and are contested: Belarus, Eastern Europe, and revolution. So a few words about Belarus. As you can see from the map, this is map of Europe. Belarus is a Central European state. It's located exactly in the center of European continent. You can see this yellow spot. The center of Europe is located somewhere in the western part of Belarus. So this is not Eastern Europe, it's not Eurasia, it's not Russia or something like this. It's just, very center of Europe. It's probably the most Central European state. But of course, we are not accustomed to this view of European continent. We have a kind of political geography, not physical geography. So Belarus is undermined, downgraded in many ways. It's first of all, it's named wrongly. Belarus is very often called Belarusia. I beg you not to call it Belarusia because it's wrong both linguistically and politically. Its self-name is Belarus. Belarusia is a sort of colonial legacy. And Belarus refers to Rus, to medieval entity which existed 1,000 years ago on the territory of today's Belarus and Ukraine. Russia is a new invention. It was created actually in the early 18th century. The word was coined in the early 18th centuries. It's derived from Rus, not vice versa. So it's important because if you call Belarus Belarusia, it implies that it's something like something derived from Russia. It's not. Secondly, Belarus is downgraded geographically because it's often is considered as non-European state. Many people in the West believe that it's non-European state. It's downgraded politically because it's often labeled as last dictatorship. Yes, it's dictatorship, but probably not last, because there is very similar dictatorship in Azerbaijan, and there is dictatorship in Russia, which is not just dictatorship, but it's a rogue state. But nonetheless, both Russia and Azerbaijan are admitted to Council of Europe and to Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. So it's, again, we have this kind of double standards. And finally, Belarus is often downgraded culturally, as allegedly bereft of any distinct culture and national identity, and therefore having no right to exist. Here is a very, very graphical quotation from influential newspaper Asia Times. where the observer argues that no one cares about Belarus. It has never had an independent national existence or a national culture. The first grammar in Belarusian language was not printed until 1918, and little over a third of population of Belarus speaks the language at home. Never has a territory with 10 million people had a sillier case for independence. First of all, it's not true what is said here. All these facts are wrong. But secondly, even if it was true, it's not any kind of criteria for existence or non-existence of nation state. It's absurd. But nonetheless, such arguments are raised and they are spread, and they reflect some kind of specific mental matrix, which is not so unique, unfortunately. Secondly, the second term I'd like to problematize, of course, it's Eastern Europe. It's a political term. Of course, it has nothing to do with geography. It's derived from political division of Europe after the Second World War. Today, it has two meanings. In narrow sense, is countries of the former Eastern Bloc, countries which had communist regimes after the Second World War. So all the states, East European states west of the Soviet Union, and it has today it has broader sense, which includes both the communist bloc and Western republics of the former Soviet Union, which are marked here on the map in green. So this is larger Eastern Europe. This is old Eastern Europe, communist bloc, Eastern Bloc, and so-called new Eastern Europe, former republics of Western republics of the former Soviet Union. What is important here is that Eastern Europe is, at least since the age of Enlightenment, considered as something inferior. It's both a stigma and a curse. It's seen as semi-oriental and a symbol of backwardness. Today, it has two meanings, but both of them are undermining. Both of them reflect sort of philosophic geography. It's not my term, a term introduced by Larry Wolff in his seminal book, Invention of Eastern Europe. And he defines it as a geography subordinated to specific philosophic values. That is, ideological preferences. Greece is very graphic example of such ideological preferences, because technically it belongs to the East, but it was recognized as a Western country after the Second World War and brought into the Western camp. So philosophic geography reflects and is reflected on mental maps, not so much on geographic maps, but on mental maps. Geographically, sensu stricto, the only East European state is Russia. Russia occupies 1/3 of European continent. The post-communist states, so-called former Soviet bloc and former Soviet West, occupies the other third one. So in fact, they are Central Europe. These geographic technicalities would have been of little importance if they did not have political and ideological, so philosophic implications. What's wrong with being East European? The problem is that in this part of the continent, being East defined as European means to be left in some very nebulous, very vague, very unclear space, which is very often is defined as Eurasia or Western Eurasia. We have such terms for Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, for this former Western Soviet republics. Of course, it's very uncomfortable space, because it implies that these countries, these states, somehow belong to Russian sphere of influence. All of them are subsumed under this brand of Eurasia, which is just a code name for former Soviet space. And after Edward Said, this new brand of Eurasianism can be defined as an attempt to control and manipulate the so-called Eurasia, that is post-Soviet republics. The term is embraced both in Russia and paradoxically in the West. In Russia, the Eurasian discourse aims primarily at dominance over and reintegration of the post-Soviet space. In the West, it aims primarily at marginalization of the post-Soviet republics, their exclusion from the European project, specifically from the EU and NATO, and placing them within the Russian sphere of influence in the kind of new Yalta. Here, you can see how this, European neighborhood looks. This map illustrates so-called European neighborhood policy, which was invaded by the European Union. And please note that this policy is called not European Union neighborhood policy, but European neighborhood policy. So all these states on the map, which marked brown, of North Africa, of Middle East, and of East Europe, or New East Europe, including Belarus, are considered as neighbors not just of European Union, but of Europe, because Europe is tantamount, it's identical with European Union. Europe and European Union are the same. So all these countries are presumably implicitly are non-European. Of course, it's very odd. I mentioned already that Belarus is a very central European state geographically. So, of course, ultimately, European Union corrected this very strange policy, and they separated it for two different policies: one for Mediterranean states, which are geographically non-European, and the other one for East European, including Belarus, Ukraine, and also states of South Caucasus. There are 6 states which are eligible to participate in this Eastern Partnership policy designed by European Union. Belarus technically is eligible, but it doesn't participate because it's seen as the last European dictatorship, so so far it's excluded. Maybe after the revolution, after successful revolution, it would join. And finally, the third problem, the third term which should be problematized is, of course, revolution. There is a long list of definitions of revolution. All of them include something like, radical political and social changes, and which are accompanied by some mass mobilization, upheaval, uprising, sometimes violence. This is the rare case when I prefer the definition from Wikipedia, because it has a very important word, very important caveat, an effort. So it's not just radical changes, social, political changes, but could be an effort to do these changes. So, which means that revolution not necessarily should be successful. An effort to complete revolution is also a revolution, even though unsuccessful. And it's very important to keep this in mind, because in many cases, especially in Eastern Europe, in New Eastern Europe, revolutions of 1989, 1991 were not successful. They are unfinished, but they were revolutions, and they still should be completed, and I believe they will be completed. As I mentioned at the beginning, the great 1989 East European Revolution had the same causes in all countries and had same agendas. The revolution was a response of national societies to 3 interdependent problems: economic stagnation and inability to satisfy material needs of citizens, political repressiveness of regimes, and colonial or semi-colonial dependence of local regimes and societies upon the Moscow center. And they had the same agenda: social, economic reforms, political democratization, and national liberation. So because of this, they attracted broad popular base, as we see actually today in Belarus. It was a sort of marriage of convenience of very different political forces that after the victories, they of course diverged. They moved into different directions, but now they are opportunistically united by common cause. What is also important to emphasize here is that revolutions usually occur when the evolutionary way of development is blocked. So their primary goal is to unblock this way, to clear up the way forward rather than to solve fundamental problems, because these problems require long-term evolutionary efforts. In Eastern Europe, revolutions as a return to the arrested, interrupted evolution mean a return to what was before the communism. Belarus is no exception in this regard, even though Belarusian National Republic in 1918 was very short-lived, but it had its own flag, anthem, coat of arms, historical narrative, and all these symbols were established in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. Then 4 years later, they were scrapped by Lukashenko, but now they are resurrected and reestablished again. It's very, very important. You may see this, this semi-forbidden Belarusian flag and coat of arms, which became symbols of Belarusian revolution. This is old, this Lukashenko's flag, Soviet, which is actually Soviet, flag of Soviet Belarus. And you can see how popular these new symbols in Belarus became. You can see them on the balconies, you can see them on the square. In the mass demonstration, you can see them actually also in cartoons. The great European revolutions can be seen as attempt to complete unfinished process of 1989-1991, process which brought radical changes in Central East Europe and the Baltics, that is in nation states which historically belonged to the realm of Western Christianity, and which inherited more advanced political culture, traditions of statehood and civility. Conversely, in the Balkans and European part of the former Soviet Union, revolutions brought rather mixed results, since neither new democratic forces nor ancient regimes were strong enough to gain upper hand. So as a result, the hybrid, so-called pacted regimes emerged. Eventually, yet, in the Balkan states, under Western auspices, democratic transition was completed more or less successfully. But in the post-Soviet republics, transition stagnated. These countries stagnated in their hybridity, like Ukraine or Moldova, or they turned back to dictatorship, like Russia under Putin or Belarus under Lukashenko. So here is a graph which illustrates dynamic of development. It's constructed built upon data from Freedom House, which estimates process of democratization in different countries. Here, what is important here, you can see blue line, which refers to the most successful post-communist states of Central Europe, Central East Europe, and the Baltics, which immediately after the collapse of communism jumped up to the level of semi-consolidated democracies, ultimately consolidated democracies. You can see the blue line, violet line, which refers to Central Asia, states which actually fell down after, even fell down from the level of Gorbachev's perestroika, so they became consolidated autocracies. And the most interesting is, of course, this green line and purple, which refers to Balkan states and to Western post-Soviet republics. You may see that within a few years, they were more or less on the same level. And ultimately, in the end of 1990s, Balkan states went up, they democratized, they reformed under Western assistance, while post-Soviet, Western post-Soviet republics gradually fell down. So this reflects how important is external influence for the process of democratization. Belarus, of course, was left in the cold, like Ukraine, like Moldova, and of course, today they are far behind not only Central East European neighbors, but also behind Balkan states, which initially were very similar in both political and economic and social terms. Today you can see how diverged trajectories of post-communist states. You can see blue countries which are authoritarian, consolidated autocracies. You can see green, green-marked states which are consolidated democracies. And you can see orange and yellow states which are sort of hybrid regimes in both the Balkans and in western parts of the former Soviet Union. Belarus, strangely enough, Belarus belongs to this blue part of the map. And of course, it's very curious why Belarus and Russia ended up in the group of authoritarian states of Central Asia, that is countries which belong to Islamic civilization, and why they do not belong to the kindred nation states of the Balkans and Western republics of the former Soviet Union, which belong to the area of Eastern Christianity, of the Orthodox realm. Where hybrid regimes, semi-democratic regimes evolved, not autocratic. I'm not going to discuss Russia here because it's a continental empire and it represents a particular case, so it requires separate analysis. But as to Belarus, I believe it differed from kin nations in two regards. First, it had too weak national identity, unable to facilitate civic and civic nationalist mobilization in the early 90s. And secondly, the modernizing centers, capital city, and pro-Western elite were too weak in Belarus at the time. And because of this, they lost to the neo-Soviet conservative patrimonial periphery, epitomized by Lukashenko. This is actually a theory developed by late Dmitry Furman. So both factors, which were important in the 1990s, they changed within the past 2 decades, paradoxically under authoritarian state building pursued by Lukashenko, but also because of relative openness of Belarus to the West and to diffusion of Western ideas and values. So all these changes placed Belarus on a par with other kin nations of Eastern Europe and pave a way to hybrid regimes that is likely to emerge sooner or later after Lukashenko's departure. This is my conclusion. I believe that this is actually what we'll see sooner or later, maybe not this year, maybe not in 5 years, but basically we can celebrate the emergence of modern nation and of modern civil society in Belarus. We have a lot of facts. We witness this process, and this allows us to look rather optimistically into the future.
Thank you very much, Mykola, for your very interesting talk. I should add that this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. For those that missed it and couldn't, please let them know that you've heard about it. And secondly, we'll have a chance now to submit questions. You can submit questions to our speaker through Zoom on the Q&A tab and on the YouTube through the live chat. In the meantime, I have a few questions for Mykola. During these protests in Belarus, we sometimes have heard the phrase, anything but a Maidan. Yes. My question is, how has this information about the Maidan, coming from Russia mostly, but amplified from other sources, how has this information about the Maidan contributed to how the protests are organized and the goals of this Belarus protest? Does the myth or the self-identity of the Belarusians as a peaceful, passive folk, as opposed to Ukrainians, I believe, does this play a role in what is happening at the protests and what may happen there?
Well, first of all, I'd like to remark that most people are peaceful. Actually, all people are peaceful unless and until they are provoked, until they are somehow forced to violence. Ukrainian Revolution, Orange Revolution, was also very peaceful. It was like festival, but changed 10 years later, and largely because of various provocations, I believe deliberate provocations. So we cannot exclude also such provocations in Belarus. So we should not rely too much on the peaceful character of the people. People can be provoked. We should remember that both in Russia and Belarus, Ukraine is a kind of scarecrow. The propaganda, local propaganda, did their best to scare people with Euromaidan, with Ukrainian upheavals. Events here had been represented as a sort of, as a fascist putsch, as a anarchy, as pogroms, and so on. Of course, it was not true, but I think that many people, at least some people, believe this, and of course, this makes them also very wary. I noticed that Belarusians try to distance themselves from Ukrainian experience, either sincerely or tactically, but they try to emphasize that we are not like Ukraine. We are pursuing our own way, and we like to pursue peaceful revolution, peaceful transit of power. Which is okay, but Ukraine also did it in 2004-5. So I understand this. Either it's sincere belief or misbelief, or it's just tactical rhetoric. But I can understand their situation. Also, I understand their persistent emphasis that their revolution is not aimed against Russia. They still would like to maintain friendly relations. Ukraine also wanted to have friendly relations with Russia, and actually it was emphasized during Orange Revolution, if you remember, but of course it was not the case during Euromaidan, especially after Russian invasion in Crimea and in Donbass. So everything can change. So we should remember that neither Ukraine nor Belarus are single players in this game, and there are external players, specifically Russia, which is able to interfere and to do some very unexpected things. So my feeling is that in Belarus they achieved something very important. They achieved mass mobilization, which was largely impossible before this. There were a lot of protests in Belarus. Actually, every presidential elections or parliamentary elections ended up with protests. There were protests because all these elections were falsified. But these protests were effectively marginalized and dispersed and repressed by the regime. They did not gain mass support. I believe for many reasons. Perhaps partly because the regime maintained some sort of legitimacy, did not lose it completely as now, but also probably because the regime was rather successful in packing Belarusian opposition into, so to say, nationalistic niche. More or less the same what Yanukovych tried to do all the time to represent his opponents as nationalists, as rabid nationalists or fascists. Lukashenko did the same with his own opposition, but today this rhetoric doesn't work. He tries to misrepresent his opponents as nationalists, but everybody understands it's not true. This very, very large scale, it's movement of very different people with different views, different languages, ethnicities, and so on. There are actually most people are Russian speaking in Belarus, and so it's difficult to suspect them in some specific anti-Russian feelings. So I believe it's paradoxically this. Appeared to be a kind of asset for Belarusians. I don't know how it will be in the long run, but maybe, of course, loss of national language and culture is very traumatic, and I hope it wouldn't happen in Belarus. But this predominance of Russian speakers in Belarus, and the very fact that these protests speak Russian, actually this disarms the regime. They have no arguments. It's very difficult for them to depict this people as crazy nationalists. So this is very interesting aspect. I think, no, I have huge doubt whether Lukashenko will step down. Most people don't believe this because he's not just dictator, he's a committed dictator. And I happened to read one of his interviews when he very sincerely confesses that I cannot imagine my life. He says that I understand that probably I ruled for too long. It's 26 years, it's too much. But and probably some changes are needed. He recognizes. But I cannot imagine what would I do if I step down. He cannot imagine any future. He's a person who has no ideas how to live without this power, without state rule. So it's really a big problem for Belarusians, how to persuade him, how to force him to step down. And I have no answer to this. I rather believe, it's maybe not very comfortable conclusion, but for me, it resembles this upheaval in Belarus resembles rather early Polish uprisings, maybe Polish, not so much 1989 as 1980, when Solidarność was created, and it was the first large-scale protest in Eastern Bloc, supported by workers, and mass protest, mass upheaval. But external situation, domestic situation was not suitable for radical changes. Moscow did not allow victory of solidarity in 1981. We remember that it ended up with a Moscow instigated military coup under the threat of military invasion. So solidarity was repressed at the time. But 8-9 years later, the situation changed both in Moscow and eventually in Poland, and the revolution was very successful. Solidarity won overwhelmingly. And I believe this is, for Belarus, it's whatever happens, but I believe it's very good beginning. It's beginning of something very new. It wouldn't be exaggeration to say that the nation is really born. Nation and civil society are born in Belarus.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in from Kimberly O'Haver has a question. There's kind of a long background. I'll try to summarize. She had worked with the youth initiative of the Open Society Foundations in Belarus, and she is interested, she wants to know, what do we know about youth engagement and young people's activism in Belarus right now? Is there a generational thing? Are the youth a big part of this movement?
As we see from reports, from video records, from photographs, we can see that mostly young people participate in this. It's a revolution of young people. So it's probably not incidentally people who grew up in independent Belarus, who know nothing about actually Soviet life. They are Belarusians politically, whatever language they speak, but they are Belarusians. They attach themselves to this country, and they want themselves and their children to live in this country. So obviously they want this country to be free and prosperous and so on. And really it's unique. I observed revolutions in Ukraine, in Georgia, actually in Kyrgyzstan. They have different participants. In Belarus, young people predominate. It's like, I would say, like 90% of people on the streets that we see are young people. So it's really great, and this additional factor which makes us optimistic, because these people actually are future of Belarus. They would determine tomorrow's policy of Belarus, tomorrow's changes in Belarus. It's very, very good sign.
Mykola, you had mentioned more active use of certain symbols, Belarusian national symbols like the flag. But then you also mentioned what might be helpful in this case is the fact that most of the people involved in the revolution are Russian speakers. But my question is, does the Belarusian language have some kind of function or symbolic role at the protest? Do you believe that there will be some spark some sort of revival of this endangered language because of these protests, or is that something that will be down the road with these protests?
I'm rather cautiously optimistic about this. So I don't, I'm not sure about, full revival of Belarusian language, but probably as a second language, one of two languages in Belarus, it would be revived. Because officially Belarus is bilingual country, it's enshrined in Belarusian constitution, this bilingualism, but it's Soviet kind of bilingualism because it's not, there are no mechanism to protect weaker language, which is Belarusian. So it should be, of course, amended somehow. Maybe there is nothing wrong in bilingualism, but not in Soviet-style bilingualism. It should be European-style bilingualism, which requires service in both languages from both state servants and from private businesses as well. My feeling is that in Belarus we observe a revival not only of symbols, state symbols like national flag or anthem, but also of language. Language plays at least very important symbolic role. We see a lot of slogans written in Belarusian. We see how these crowds listen to poets, to singers who perform in Belarusian language. Some very popular songs are performed in Belarusian. So at least it acquired very important symbolic role, Belarusian language. So how long this way from symbolic importance to daily usage, how long this way is, I don't know. In Ireland, for example, Gaelic remained largely symbolic. It's symbolic, it's important, it's recognized, it's respected, but still it's, it's like Ukrainian embroidery on the wall. It's nice, nice to watch, but not to use daily. In Belarus, probably it wouldn't happen because Belarusian is not as remote from Russian, is not so distinct. Most people have at least passive command of Belarusian language, so it can be easily revitalized. It's just a matter of its importance, of recognition, symbolic recognition, symbolic importance may play very important role in this revival. Actually, as it happens in Ukraine, in southeastern Ukraine, where also situation was very similar to Belarusian, where Ukraine was marginalized under colonial rule, and this situation persisted in first decades of independence. So major cities are largely Russian-speaking, but nonetheless, symbolic importance of Ukraine is recognized. The Russian-Ukraine war galvanized catalyzed this attitude, this positive attitude, and now we see more and more young people who are at least bilingual, actively bilingual, who very easily switch to Ukrainian if necessary, if they wish, depending on situation. And probably there is the only way from Russian monolingualism to bilingualism is by learning, doing by learning. Learning by doing.
Yeah, and you wonder if that is the case, if there will be a bit of more of a resonance of Belarusian language, Belarusian culture, literature as a result. I mean, I remember in the late 90s when I was living in Ukraine, you would have rock bands coming that sang in Belarusian and performing with Ukrainian bands, and there was a few poetry events where Ukrainian writers, I remember even the writers of Luhasad had this contact with Belarusian writers that would come and they would have these evenings, but it was quite marginal. I mean, it was very underground. It was actually not really on a public level that much. But I see now there's this wonderful initiative that PEN Ukraine has done with these evenings of solidarity with a lot of these younger writers in Ukraine now performing online, of course, with Belarusian writers. And I wonder if a similar phenomenon could happen where in those 1990s, when Polish writers kind of were interested in Ukrainian writers and helped promote them, they would translate them into Polish, yes, and publish them and invite them. And then eventually that led to Germany and then farther west. Could possibly, if there is this revived energy towards Belarusian literature, could Ukraine act as, or Poland again, act as a bridge of letting the world know more about what is happening in Belarusian literature?
Well, Ukraine is not strong enough, is not as strong as Poland, or let alone Germany or United States to promote even its own culture. But nonetheless, I believe that we can do something. And this, you mentioned this presentations, these online meetings with Belarusian colleagues are important as a sort of encouragement, a sort of recognition, actually. We don't need so much translation from Belarusian. Well, we need it because it's interesting, but generally we understand Belarusian. It's the closest language for us. It's 90% same words in Ukrainian and Belarusian, so it's really the closest languages, closest Slavonic languages, probably even closer than Czech and Slovak. It was big surprise for many Ukrainians because until recently they knew very little about Belarus, and many Ukrainians believe that we cannot understand Belarusian, something some Slavonic language which is not comprehensive, and probably we should communicate in Russian intermediary. Suddenly it appears it's absolutely comprehensive. It's absolutely, we can communicate without any intermediary, and it's really great discovery. In Ukraine, it greatly facilitates actually performance of Belarusians in Ukraine and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So of course I believe in this cooperation. I believe in this kind of symbiosis. It's really the case when some sort of proximity may be very fruitful, may eventuate in some very positive results, because neither Belarusians nor Ukrainians have any imperial ambitions. We are really equal. Even though maybe Ukraine is a bit more advanced because it was luckier to, yes.
Oh, sorry, you cut out there for a second.
No, that's. I just wanted to maybe to add that yes, we would like to promote Belarusians as much as possible, to use our personal contacts in different countries, but of course to publish their books in Ukraine and it's really very interesting literature, very interesting culture. What is important here to emphasize that it's very modern culture, very modern literature, because in the colonial times, both Ukrainian and Belarusian cultures were artificially marginalized as rural, as provincial, as something pre-modern, something 19th century, which is something that doesn't have any prospects for the future. This was a very effective way to destroy cultures. They were not forbidden. Neither language nor culture were forbidden in the Soviet Union. Ukrainian and Belarusian could be practiced, basically published and taught in schools. But everything was done to make their image absolutely backward. And of course, this distracted many people. It was like, sign of backwardness. It was stigma. Now it changes. And I believe it's very important to stress that, it's very dynamic, very modern, very, very contemporary culture, both in Ukraine and Belarus. So in this regard, we can, of course, encourage each other and to promote each other.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Okay, we have another question from David Shra. For someone with little knowledge, how, in summary, should one think about the pre-1918 history of Belarus? How much national identity was there? Was it strong or diffused in the Russian Empire? How much of the weak national identity was a result of Stalinist suppression?
Pre-1991?
Pre-1918 history of Belarus.
Pre-1918.
How much identity was, how developed was the Belarusian national identity pre-1918? I guess a comparison of how Belarusian identity existed within the Russian Empire and how it existed in the Soviet Empire.
Well, yes, Belarus, of course, this example was very, very late national awakening, so to say, of delayed nation building. It's occurred much later than in Ukraine, because in Ukraine, process started in the early 19th century. Ukraine probably had better starting position. On the one hand, there was Ukraine autonomy in Russian Empire, Cossack autonomy. And there was Cossack elite, which was gentrified and Russified, but still maintained some, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian sentiments like Mykola and so on. And also Ukrainian had western part which was under Habsburg, so it was not oppressed. It could pass all these, stages of Miroslav Hroch's national development from cultural stage to political stage. So of course Ukraine was lucky in many regards than Belarus, but nonetheless the process of state making, nation making was very similar in all stateless nations in Europe, and Belarus was no exception. In the 19th century, there was some Belarusian movement, and in the early 20th century, when oppressions in Tsarist Empire eased a little bit, of course, Belarusian newspapers and cultural institutions emerged. I believe that also 1920s were very important in this regard, because it was very short period of Soviet nativization, Koreanization, so-called. I believe that Belarusian identity was, of course, first of all, a local identity for decades. Actually, even today, for many people, it's first of all local identity. It's a mixture of local and East Slavonic imaginary community belonging to this imaginary East Slavonic community, this greater Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox world. For some people, it's post-Soviet world or Soviet world. So it's this mixture of different identities, but I believe that the very existence of Belarusian state since 1991 solidified Belarusian identity, regardless of of ethnicity, language. But all these people are citizens of Belarus, and as time passes, they become more and more entrenched, more and more committed, attached to this nation, to this country. They actually have no other identity, or less and less. Because of course initially these identities were compatible. It was like matryoshka, Belarusian local identity was compatible with greater Soviet identity, like smaller matryoshka within a bigger matryoshka, or within Russian imperial identity. There was no contradiction between this local identity of Belarusian or Ukrainian and imperial, either Tsarist or Soviet. Today, independent states, I believe that they largely solve this problem, because they inculcate people with absolutely national or nationalistic view. Either Lukashenko wants it or not, but the very fact of the existence of the state makes Belarusians nationalist in neutral sense. I don't anything negative. It's just some sort of national consciousness, some sort of national centric view of the world, because they every day they watch TV, which starts with Belarusian news, which ends with Belarusian weather forecast, and reports about successes of Belarusian sports teams, and so on. So it works with or without Lukashenko. It works, and it's just a matter of time when Belarus will be full-fledged nation. Actually, it's already is, as we see.
Thank you. Question, Celine Benji Gumruchku. I'm sorry to mispronounce your name. The question is, do you think the pandemic and the social and economic problems it caused provided some sort of opportunity for the protests? Can it be something to be considered when trying to answer the why not before but now question?
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree. It largely explains why protests against electoral fraud acquired such a large scale today. Because, as I mentioned, they occurred before. Every Belarusian elections were accompanied by protests, because all of them were falsified. But now, I believe that the scale of this protest was multiplied, amplified by both economic crisis and the COVID crisis, and also this two crises and very important response of authorities, of Lukashenko in particular, also delegitimized authorities. Because you remember that Lukashenko initially he made mockery, he mocked. He ridiculed, this panic. Yeah, he told, well, it's not serious. We are real men. We are real Soviet men. We should not be afraid of any, small viruses. It's peanuts. He proved his stupidity, of course, but and of course he's paying for this again, because it contributed to his delegitimization. So it's not only matter of falsified elections, which was typical situation for Belarus, but also more broader situation. On one hand, we have this delegitimization of authorities. We have crisis, current epidemic crisis and economic crisis, but on the other hand, of course, we have gradual strengthening of Belarusian nation, of Belarusian society. So there are two interdependent processes: weakening of authorities and strengthening of people power of society.
Well, this leads well into this question. Susan Freeman asks, what does the role of police and security forces in these protests in Belarus for repression? And also some retired officers have spoken out against repression. What do these police and security forces mean for the future of the state tool for the use of force?
It's difficult to predict because, of course, so far most of these people do not reveal their views for obvious reasons, and there are not so many cases of their switching sides, which is also a difficult thing for military people, for people who are in this kind of service. I believe that this process may take a lot of time. For a number of reasons. First of all, because security forces, Belarus army and police, they are privileged in a way. Moreover, they are staffed with the people who actually have no other place, no other professions. They have everything they can, beat protesters and so on. So it's really very sad news. Many of these people are very poorly educated. Most of them have just some very basic education. So I wonder if they can find any other job, and so it complicates their change of their behavior, of their mind. Of course, I'm not sure that all of them are like this. Probably there are different people. There are some officers which are probably better educated, and probably, of course, people are different everywhere, and I cannot exclude there are also very different people. Actually, we have some cases when people in the police refuse to fulfill orders, and when they retired from the service. So it's important because without some split within within authoritarian power, revolution cannot win. At least peacefully, it cannot win until and unless there are very serious cracks in ruptures in these monolithic authorities. There are very meager chances for victory. So of course, I believe that both protesters but also international communities should work on this, to split authorities, to somehow to encourage this split. I believe that international sanctions can be one of the factors which would force many representatives of the ruling elites to think twice before using force, violence, killing people, beating people. They should know that all these actions, all these orders they give should be punished, very seriously punished internationally. So I believe this is so far the only thing that international community can do for Belarus to very severely ostracize and sanction all the people, all the representatives of ruling elite at all levels who are in some way participating in repressions, in killing, beating, illegal arresting, falsifying of elections, and so on. So there should be a long list of these violators.
Thank you. Well, we have 2 minutes left. We have 2 questions. I'll see if we can get through both of them. One's short, one's a bit longer. We'll start with the longer one. Anonymous, could you please elaborate on your assumption that Central Asian states are prone to authoritarianism because of their Islamic background? Do you assume that Slavic states do not have an authoritarian past? What about Soviet Union and the Russian Empire?
Well, first of all, I don't insist. I don't maintain this essentialist approach. So I don't think that any country is excluded from this democratic way of development. What I mean is that, history and culture and civilizational belonging do matter. They, of course, they influence, they inform political culture and mentality and so on. So basically, democratic changes are possible everywhere, but in some places they would take much more time and would require much more efforts. This is a simple thing. So I cannot exclude that, that Central Asian states at some point may reform, because, freedom is basically its universal value. And we see some examples, positive examples. We see that, some states, they are not as authoritarian as other states. For example, Kyrgyzstan is relatively pluralistic society, not democratic, but pluralistic. We can see actually quite successful case of Mongolia, which is not Muslim, but basically it's belonged to so-called Asia and is largely undervalued as a success story, but it's by and large a success story. So everything is possible. We should keep it in mind. But of course, more efforts are needed and more specific policies are needed and so on. As to authoritarian past, as to the Soviet past, of course, I agree that it was very harmful for all the former Soviet republics, especially for Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, republics which belonged for more than 70 years to the Soviet Union, and before that to Russian Empire. So of course they were in more disadvantaged position than Central East European states, which belonged to either to Habsburgs, which were more liberal, or to Prussia. This is true. This, again, history do matter. But I believe that even more important was for eventual development was some tradition of statehood which did not exist or was very short-lived in Belarus or Ukraine, and which did exist in Central and South Europe, in Romania and Bulgaria. They were authoritarian, but they still had some, tradition of statehood in the interwar period, and of course, it was easier for them to reestablish institutions, to reestablish some practices, and to democratize them. So they had to pursue only, so-called double transition, democratization and marketization. In Ukraine, in Belarus, we have to carry out quadruple transition: democratization, marketization, state building, and nation building. So it's much bigger challenge. Maybe it can be compared only to some post-Yugoslavian states like Macedonia or Bosnia. They have the same problems. They also have state building problem and nation building problem. And again, you can see how difficult transition is going there. And so there are a lot of similarities that we have to understand. So my conclusion is that that history does matter, culture does matter, tradition does matter, civilizational belonging does matter, but it's not deterministic. It does matter, but it doesn't determine everything, because there are also human agencies. There are specific policies which can influence the processes. We have some corridor of opportunities, and we have to fully use this corridor of opportunities, or we can spoil it. It also happens.
Thank you. And a final question from Maria Shavalova, who was our visitor Fulbright visitor last year at Harriman. Taking advantage of your impeccable taste in literature, Mykola, can you recommend some contemporary Belarusian fiction?
Well, of course, I would like to recommend, first of all, Belarusian poets, because I believe that Andrei Khodounovich is the greatest poet. It's really one of the best European poets, I believe. And if somebody had to be nominated to Nobel Prize in literature, it should be Belarusian Andrei Khodounovich. There was Vasil Bykov, but he died and he didn't receive this prize, even though he was also great writer. As to prose, I believe that Orlov is very good prose writer. And for me, very unexpected, very interesting discovery was Vladimir Neklyayev's novel. He is a poet. He wrote, as far as I know, only one novel, but this novel was autobiographical, and this novel recollects the history of 1960s, 70s generation it tells the story which is largely unknown internationally, or even probably in Belarus, because it's recollects the history of underground artistic movement in Belarus. We know nothing about this, actually. We know something about Ukrainian underground, cultural underground of 1960s, 70s, but nothing about Belarus. So Nikolaev is very interesting in this regard. But Arlo probably is the most interesting.
Thank you for those recommendations. Well, I also want to thank everyone who tuned in today to listen to our talk and who posed questions. Again, this will be available on our YouTube site shortly. Stay tuned for that. And please visit our Harriman Institute website for our upcoming events. We have several in Ukrainian studies coming also, and we'll be adding more as the semester evolves. And finally, I'd like to thank our speaker, Mykola Riabchuk, for a very interesting talk on a very important topic, and I think we learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.